Somewhere in the forests of Poland, there's a bunker with walls 8 meters thick that the Nazis tried to blow up and couldn't. In Albania, there are 750,000 concrete domes scattered across every hillside, beach, and cemetery in the country. And off the coast of England, armed towers still stand in the ocean, built during World War II, abandoned ever since. The 20th century left behind weapons that could destroy civilization, but it also left behind the places those weapons were supposed to protect. Bunkers, bases, radar arrays the size of skyscrapers. Most of them were abandoned the moment they stopped being useful. Some of them were classified for decades. All of them are still standing. These are the war relics the world forgot. In the Masurian forest of northern Poland, about 8 kilometers east of the town of Kętrzyn, there's a complex of massive concrete bunkers being slowly consumed by the woods. This is the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's secret Eastern Front headquarters during World War II. Construction started in the fall of 1940. 3,000 German laborers cleared forest and poured concrete for what would become one of the most fortified compounds on Earth. Over 80 structures were built: bunkers, barracks, communication buildings, an airfield. The whole thing was invisible from the air. They suspended fake vegetation on wires above the buildings and changed it with the seasons to match the surrounding forest. The Allies never discovered it, not once during the entire war. Hitler arrived on June 24th, 1941, 2 days after the invasion of the Soviet Union. He would spend 850 days at the Wolf's Lair, more time than at any other location during the war. From this hidden compound in the woods, he directed military operations across the Eastern Front. Decisions about the death camps were made here. The fates of entire nations were decided in rooms buried under meters of reinforced concrete. 3 security zones surrounded the central complex: landmines, barbed wire, anti-aircraft batteries, armed SS guards at every checkpoint. The innermost zone contained bunkers for Hitler, Goering, Bormann, Keitel, and Jodl. Up to 3,000 personnel lived and worked inside the compound at its peak. It was a self-contained military city, built to be invisible and indestructible. But on July 20th, 1944, the biggest threat came from within. A German officer named Klaus von Stauffenberg walked into a briefing room carrying a bomb in his briefcase. He placed it under a heavy oak table, about 3 feet from where Hitler was standing, and left the room. The bomb detonated. 4 people were killed, but the briefcase had been moved behind a thick table leg, and Hitler survived. Stauffenberg was executed that same night. 4 months later, the Red Army pushed to within 10 miles of the compound. Hitler left the Wolf's Lair for the last time on November 20th, 1944. He ordered it destroyed. The SS packed the bunkers with tons of explosives and detonated them in January 1945. But the walls were so thick, up to 8 meters of steel-reinforced concrete, that most of the bunkers only partially collapsed. They blew up their own creation, and it barely flinched. The Red Army walked in 2 days later without firing a single shot. It took another 10 years just to clear the 54,000 landmines surrounding the complex. Today, the Wolf's Lair is a museum. You can walk through the ruins. The forest is reclaiming it. Trees growing through cracked concrete, moss blanketing the rubble. But the bones of the thing are still there. 80 years later, you can still stand inside Hitler's bunker. If the Wolf's Lair was one man's fortress, Albania is what happens when one man tries to turn an entire country into a fortress. Between 1967 and 1986, the communist dictator Enver Hoxha ordered the construction of an estimated 750,000 concrete bunkers across Albania. That's one bunker for every 4 citizens. 14 bunkers per square mile. They're everywhere, on mountaintops, in farmers' fields, on beaches, in playgrounds, in cemeteries. You can't look in any direction in Albania without seeing at least one. Hoxha was pathologically paranoid. He started as a Soviet ally, then broke with Moscow after Stalin's death. He allied with China, then broke with them too. By the late 1970s, Albania had no allies at all. Hoxha was convinced that NATO, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, essentially everyone, was planning to invade, so he built bunkers, hundreds of thousands of them. The most common type was the QZ bunker, a small concrete dome about 2 meters across, big enough for 1 or 2 people, with a horizontal gun slit. They were prefabricated and dropped into position across the landscape like mushrooms. Larger command bunkers could hold up to 10 soldiers, with walls a full meter thick, capable of withstanding continuous artillery fire. And beneath cities like Tirana, Hoxha built massive underground nuclear shelters for the party leadership, ringed with 50 concentric circles of surface bunkers radiating outward. The program consumed a quarter of Albania's national budget. Each individual bunker cost the equivalent of a 2-room apartment. Building 20 bunkers cost the same as 1 kilometer of road. The money came directly from education, healthcare, and housing, the things Albanians actually needed. The country became one of the poorest in Europe, but it had more bunkers per square mile than anywhere on the planet. The invasion never came, not once. Hoxha died in 1985. The program stopped. The bunkers were abandoned, and Albania was left with a problem no one knew how to solve. Each bunker costs about 800 euros to destroy. Multiply that by 750,000. The country can't afford to remove them, and they're too solid to ignore. People have drowned in whirlpools created by coastal bunkers that subsided into the sea. Children have been injured playing on them. In 2004, officials discovered a forgotten stockpile of 16 tons of mustard gas and chemical weapons in an unguarded bunker just 40 kilometers from the capital. Some Albanians have gotten creative. In Tirana, 2 of Hoxha's nuclear shelters have been converted into the bunk art museums, history exhibits, and art galleries inside the dictator's own doomsday bunkers. Along the coast, bunkers have been turned into cafes, hamburger stands, and tattoo parlors. One became a 20-room hotel. Others house livestock, but most of them just sit there. Concrete mushrooms dotting every hillside. A paranoid dictator's legacy, baked permanently into the landscape of a country that was never attacked. If you walk along certain beaches in France, Denmark, or Norway, you'll find enormous concrete structures half buried in the sand. Some are tilted at strange angles, where the ground has shifted beneath them over 80 years. Others sit upright, facing the ocean, their gun slits still pointing toward an enemy that arrived in 1944 and never came back. This is the Atlantic Wall, Hitler's defensive line stretching from the northern tip of Norway to the French-Spanish border. Over 11,000 fortifications were built along the coastline between 1942 and 1944 under the direction of Organization Tot, using forced labor from across occupied Europe. Hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates, poured millions of tons of concrete to build bunkers, gun emplacements, anti-tank walls, and observation posts. The wall was supposed to make an Allied invasion of Western Europe impossible. It didn't. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces breached the Atlantic Wall at Normandy, and the entire system became obsolete overnight. After the war, the bunkers were simply left. Blowing them up was too expensive. Dismantling them was impractical. The walls were meters thick and reinforced with steel. So the Atlantic Wall remains, 8 decades later, slowly sinking into the beaches of Western Europe. In France, some bunkers have tilted dramatically as coastal erosion has pulled the sand from beneath them. In Denmark, bunkers that once sat on cliff tops are now on the beach after decades of erosion dropped them to sea level. In Belgium, archaeologists have excavated bunkers that were buried under meters of sand, forgotten for 80 years, still containing little but sand and seawater. Photographer Jonathan Andrew, who spent years documenting the remains, described them as looking like objects built by an alien species. Taken out of context, they're just strange geometric shapes scattered across otherwise peaceful coastlines, which is part of what makes them so unsettling. They're the permanent scars of a war that ended generations ago, and no one can figure out how to get rid of them. In 1976, shortwave radio operators around the world started hearing something strange. A sharp, repetitive tapping sound, 10 pulses per second, powerful enough to interfere with commercial aviation communications, amateur radio, and broadcast signals across the globe. Nobody knew where it was coming from. The Soviets denied it existed. People nicknamed it the Russian woodpecker. Conspiracy theories exploded. Some said the Soviets were experimenting with mind control. Others claimed it was a weather manipulation weapon. Electronics manufacturers started building woodpecker filters into their equipment just to block the signal. Amateur radio enthusiasts formed a club called the Russian Woodpecker Hunting Club, dedicated to triangulating the source. They figured it out before most governments did. The signal was coming from somewhere in Ukraine. The source was the Duga radar, an over-the-horizon early warning system built to detect the launch of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. And it was enormous. The receiving antenna alone stood 150 meters tall, roughly 50 stories, and stretched almost 700 meters long. It was one of the most powerful radar installations ever built, pumping out over 10 megawatts of power. It consumed so much electricity that it was built right next to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which supplied roughly a third of its energy. On Soviet maps, the entire installation was labeled as a children's camp. There was even a bus stop decorated with the bear mascot from the 1980 Moscow Olympics to sell the cover story. The radar cost the Soviet Union twice as much as the Chernobyl power plant itself. And there's a persistent debate about whether it actually worked properly. Some officials have claimed the system could only detect a massive, full-scale missile launch and was effectively blind to a single missile. Others say it was never fully operational at all. Then, on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl exploded. The nearby town of Pripyat was evacuated, and the Duga radar, powered by the very plant that had just melted down, went silent. Its operators were evacuated. Its documents were destroyed or classified and sent to Moscow. By 1989, the signal had stopped completely. Today, the Duga stands inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, a colossal steel skeleton rising above the irradiated forest. Since 2013, guided tours through the exclusion zone have been allowed to visit it. You can stand at its base and look straight up at 50 stories of rusting Cold War engineering, surrounded by abandoned vehicles, broken electronics, and the quiet hum of a Geiger counter. It's the most powerful thing the Soviet Union built that it won't even acknowledge existed. If you take a boat into the Thames estuary, a few miles off the coast of Kent, you'll see something that looks like it belongs in a science fiction film. Standing on steel legs in the middle of the ocean are clusters of armored towers, rusted, abandoned, connected by catwalks. Rising out of the gray water like mechanical creatures frozen mid-step. These are the Monsell sea forts, designed by engineer Guy Monsell and built in 1942 to defend the UK against German air raids and protect merchant shipping routes in the Thames. There were two types: naval forts, which were large concrete towers on pontoon bases, and army forts, which consisted of clusters of 7 interconnected steel towers, each housing different functions: Bofors guns, searchlights, radar equipment, and command centers. During the war, the forts shot down 22 aircraft and about 30 V-1 flying bombs. After the war ended, they were decommissioned in the late 1950s and simply abandoned. The military walked away and left them standing in the ocean. In the 1960s, the forts became the center of one of the strangest chapters in British broadcasting history. Pirate radio stations, illegal broadcasters operating outside UK jurisdiction, set up transmitters inside the abandoned towers and started beaming rock and pop music to mainland Britain. Radio City, Radio Such, and Screaming Lord Such's station all broadcast from the forts. There were armed standoffs between rival pirate stations fighting for control of different towers. One man was shot. The British government eventually passed legislation to shut the pirates down. One fort, Ruff's Tower, was seized in 1967 by a man named Paddy Roy Bates, who declared it the Sovereign Principality of Sealand, a self-proclaimed micronation that technically still exists today. It has its own flag, passport, and currency. The rest of the forts are slowly rusting away. Some have partially collapsed. They're not maintained. They're not protected. They're just standing there in the water, waiting for the ocean to take them. During World War II, the Nazis built some of the most indestructible buildings in human history. And they weren't bunkers. They were anti-aircraft towers. The Flak Towers were massive concrete fortresses built in Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna between 1940 and 1945. They served a dual purpose. The rooftops housed enormous anti-aircraft guns, capable of firing 8,000 rounds per minute, while the interiors sheltered up to 10,000 civilians during Allied bombing raids. They had their own water supply, their own hospital, and enough space to store priceless artwork looted from across Europe. The towers were built to be indestructible, and they are. Walls over 3.5 meters thick. Reinforced concrete poured in continuous operations to prevent structural weaknesses. The rooftops were designed to absorb direct bomb hits. When the British tried to bomb one in Hamburg, the bombs bounced off. After the war, the Allies had a problem. These towers were too massive to demolish. In Berlin, they eventually managed to blow up and bury a few of them, but it required enormous quantities of explosives and months of work. In Hamburg, one was converted into a nightclub and a music venue. Another was turned into a garden center with a rooftop park. But in Vienna, 3 of the Flak Towers still stand exactly as they were. The city simply built around them. They're surrounded by apartment buildings and parks. These hulking concrete monoliths from another era, towering over the neighborhood like brutalist cathedrals. One houses a public aquarium. The others just sit there, too expensive to remove, too heavy to ignore. They'll probably outlast every other building in the city. Deep in the farmland of eastern Washington state, 3 concrete shafts drop straight into the earth. They're filled with dark, still water that goes down further than any flashlight can reach. These are Titan I missile silos, built between 1959 and 1962 to house America's first generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Titan I was 67 feet tall and carried a 4-megaton nuclear warhead, over 200 times more powerful Then the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The silos were designed to survive a near miss from a Soviet nuclear strike, with launch control rooms, fuel storage, and living quarters buried deep underground behind blast-resistant doors. The entire system was operational for just 3 years. By 1965, the Titan I was obsolete, replaced by newer, solid-fuel missiles that could be launched faster and stored more safely. The silos were decommissioned and sold off. Some were bought by private owners. Most were simply abandoned and left to flood. Today, the Washington silos are filled with groundwater. The control rooms, the launch bays, the corridors, where soldiers once sat waiting for the order to end the world, all of it is underwater. Dive companies have offered guided dives into the flooded tunnels, though access is extremely restricted and the hazards are severe. Zero visibility, collapsing structures, entanglement risks. There's something poetic about it. The most destructive weapons ever built, designed to survive nuclear war, are now being reclaimed by groundwater. The silos that were supposed to end everything are being quietly swallowed by the earth. Every one of these structures was built because someone believed the worst was coming. Some of them saw combat. Most of them didn't. None of them worked the way their builders imagined. But concrete doesn't care about politics. It doesn't know the war is over. It just sits there, in the forests, on the beaches, in the ocean, underground, and waits. These are the monuments no one asked for. The scars that won't heal because no one can afford to remove them. The war relics the world forgot, standing quietly in places most people will never see.